My name is Kristian. I'm a senior, and I spent part of my summer in Detroit, Michigan, working with community organizers, sort of at the James and Grace Lee Bogg Center to Nurture Community Leadership. But given how close-knit the community organizing community in Detroit is, I worked with a lot of different groups around the city. And I guess I'll start with what I was focusing on, and that was this idea of visionary organizing. So I'd been to Detroit the summer before last for a 3-day conference on media, activism, and art, and had put my name down on the mailing list to learn a little bit more about organizing in Detroit. And then in February, I received an email saying, "Come to Detroit 2013, we'll be talking about visionary organizing, its nuts and bolts, what it means and how we can do it across the country." And I hadn't heard this term before, so I figured, I'd like to go to Detroit and figure out a little bit more of what that means. And instead of just spending the week there for that conference, I'd like to spend 7 to 8 weeks there digging into that as a research topic. And so that's what I did. And I'll talk about the research, but also the internship experience, because they went hand in hand. When I arrived in Detroit, I thought I would be observing this conference on visionary organizing, and taking notes as a researcher, but mostly just sitting back and watching the rest of the conference go on. Little did I know that I would be one of 5 or 6 people who wound up facilitating a lot of the conference due to some unseen circumstances with my supervisor at the organization. But that meant working with organizers from around the US, from Oakland, from Ithaca, from Detroit. I'm from New York and the Bay Area, and facilitating workshops on things like the history of student activism and the future of what that could look like. And yes, that took me through a very exciting introduction to Detroit, learning about how they address issues like food justice, youth empowerment, education, civic safety, and issues of work. And yeah, I'll leave it there for a little bit. But to move to my research, this conference brought together about 50 activists from around the country, but a lot of them based in Detroit. And so that gave me a way to, my introduction to a lot of the organizers that I wound up interviewing. And what we did was go through a series of questions, starting with how they define their communities, sort of what assets they see in their communities, what their personal history in those places have been, the issues that are now present in their neighborhoods, and sort of the historical developments that led to those issues. Because one of the things that my comrades, I wasn't an intern, I was a comrade at the Bogg Center, but one of the things that my comrades there stressed was the importance of looking at the historical developments that lead us to where we are today, so that our issues don't exist in isolation. There's a long history that leads up to them. So we went through their communities and their histories, and then started to talk about their own organizing, their assets, what they needed help with, what they needed to do their work better. Finally moving into vision. So the biggest question is, in 50 years, if all of your plans are successful, what type of world will we be living in? And moving back from that, what do we have to do now until then to get there? What values and issues do we organize? What were our principles? And so that led to some very rich discussions. So I'll spend the next few minutes talking about how I saw, visionary organizing is yet to be defined, but I'll give you examples of what I saw there and move towards the definition by the end of this presentation. So one sector, one of the largest issues in Detroit is the issue of food justice, and so there's not much access to fresh produce in the city, which has a lot of health implications for the residents. And I guess the people of Detroit have used their own resources in a very creative way to address this issue. So Detroit is a majority black city, and most of its residents are originally from the South, so they came up during one of the waves of the Great Migration in the last century. But with them, they brought a large history or knowledge of agriculture, and so about 20, almost 30 years ago, a big community farming, community gardening movement started in the city, where you would have a lot of elders who had knowledge from the South start to share that in the form of building community gardens, which not only provided a source of fresh produce for residents, but it also brought together people across generations, so that's one form of community building and knowledge sharing. And it also worked to sort of decentralize modes of production, so instead of relying on these huge grocery chains, either national or multinational, you can start very locally producing what you need for your community, and if you're the one that's running the garden, that's also a source of income for you, where you can spend a little bit less time working at a different type of job that doesn't necessarily contribute to your community, and more in community development and empowerment. And so a lot of folks that I spoke to around the city were involved with either small gardens in their backyards or larger scale operations. Another area was youth empowerment, and that came mostly through the form of the arts and media. And I guess as one maybe interesting counterpoint to what we heard from Jake a little bit earlier, one of the rappers that I met in the city has a studio in his house that he opens up to youth that want to come in and just freestyle or lay down some tracks. And his rule was, you are free to say whatever you want to say, but expect that we're going to unpack that after you're done saying it. So it allowed youth to express a lot of things that they couldn't necessarily express in other places, in school or other extracurricular locations. But then they'd sit down and do the long work of, okay, so you said this about women, what causes you to say that or think that? And let's think about why that might be a little bit off, or why we might want to fix that. And so it became a form of I don't know if therapy is the right word, but it was able to go to the root of some of the issues that a lot of the youth in the city were facing. Another area that is a big concern is education. And I had the, privilege of witnessing the development of the James and Grace Lee Boggs School in Detroit, which has been in the works for a couple of years. But they're working under a place-based education model. So that means instead of just sitting in the classroom and having your knowledge only be in the walls of the school, the surrounding community becomes the classroom. So the youth will go out into the community, learn from elders either any skills that they have, or get a sense of the oral history, the people's history of their neighborhood, of their city, of what's going on. Or things like learning math and science skills through building their own garden and the playground next to the school, so learning how volume works, learning just things like that. As I said, the school was 5 years in the making, and I had the opportunity to canvass in the neighborhood to let people know, hey, there's a school opening up around here, kindergarten through 4th grade, this is how it's going to work, you're going to be involved if you'd like to participate. We're really excited about it, and I guess to see people respond to having a new resource open up in their community, and to learn that, yes, I'm going to be involved in it, this is going to, be a community effort. That was something that was really special to witness, and I guess one thing to note is that through a lot of my interviews about community organizing and how it can be most effective, we spoke about how change isn't necessarily fast or large scale, which might be counterintuitive to, even just being at Stanford, like we always want things that are faster and bigger and better and stronger. And to think, oh no, maybe social change might be most effective when it's on my block, person to person. It might be a little bit slower, but the butterfly effect or the long-term effects can have very huge implications. So I was very aware of that working on this one school and thinking about how it can actually change what's going on in the community. But that was something that was hit home to me a lot, the importance of local change and growth. And I'm running out of time, so briefly I'll just talk about this really cool concept of new work that I learned about in Detroit. And I guess to give a brief history, so Detroit used to be the 3rd largest city in the United States. With all of the auto plants there, it was sort of the symbol of the American dream, that you can get a factory job, you don't need a college education, you can have enough money to buy a house, a car, send your kids to university. And in the 60s, with the rise of automation in the factories, most of those jobs disappeared. And so a lot of people like to attribute the start of Detroit's current issues to the 1967 rebellion, and locating that as the site of white flight from the city. But in actuality, that process was starting before the 67 rebellion, when a lot of these auto plants started to lay off workers and rely more on high technology. But the importance of that I heard from so many people across Detroit was that we can't rely on jobs to nurture our communities and ourselves. Jobs work insofar as they can provide income for food, housing, shelter, and things like that. But once those disappear, what are we left with? And how can we organize our society in ways that protect us even without jobs? So this idea of new work comes from a American-based German philosopher named Fritjof Bergman, who's based in Flint, Michigan. And the idea is that we now have the capability to use things like 3D printers or laser cutters or just small-scale tools, or tools that are small enough to actually fit in people's homes or garages or in a community center. So you can now print things like 3D wrenches or different types of tools, or send in the code to slice up wood to then put together a little shed or structure like that. And people can now start building things within their communities. So instead of, again, relying on like multinational corporations, you can have a very localized form of production. And one way that I saw this playing out on the street where I was working with the Volk Center is through a new workers cooperative where members of the house are trying to live rent-free by selling goods and services to people in their neighborhood. So one man I worked with this summer was a former Black Panther who was incarcerated for 30 years. But during that time, he took up leathercraft and makes these beautiful bags, wallets, belts, all of this stuff. And so he's working with this German professor to bring in tools to their house on Field Street in Detroit. He'll start making bags and wallets and stuff for people in the community, selling it to them at much lower prices than they would get from luxury companies. And then that money then pays his rent, and he doesn't have to necessarily rely on an outside job to do what he needs to do. It's providing something to the community, and there's a whole house full of people working on things like that. And so this is all to say that I saw a lot of really exciting examples of, right now, small-scale change happening in Detroit, but the implications for them are really very large. And I guess one of the unifying things that came across through my interviews and observations was that in order to have social change, it's not just about protest and that form of resistance, but it's also about creating at the same time. And the two need to work hand in hand if we are to achieve the world that we're interested in seeing. So moving forward, I am hoping to go back to Detroit either Thanksgiving break or winter break to finish up some interviews, since this is work that's going into my thesis. But I am also hoping to move to Detroit after I graduate and continue some of this work, because it was just I've never been somewhere in the US where I've experienced what I saw there in terms of community and energy and excitement and creativity and all that stuff. And I'm trying to figure out how to bring more Stanford folks into that type of community, because I think a lot of the energy that many of our peers put into companies like Google or Facebook or Apple, or into startups or into TFA, all of that energy can also be used to start rebuilding cities, which is a project that's not necessarily evidently important, being in the Bay Area in this big bubble, but a lot of the country is headed to where Detroit is right now, and so it's important for us to start thinking about how we can be involved civically and how we can start to rebuild our cities in ways that are sustainable for the people that live there and that need, whose lives are based there. So yeah, I guess I'll leave it there, but I had a really great summer in Detroit, and can't wait to continue this work moving forward.
We have time for one question. You gotta run.
Sure, yeah.
Have you ever heard of EPA?
EPA?
It's Palo Alto.
No.
Okay, everything you said about Detroit, EPA. There's YUCA, which is Youth United for Community Action.
Mm-hmm.
There's MAP, there's music murals and arts project. There's HHH, which is History of Hip Hop. And they have really big food justice issues, and they're right across. So if you can't go to Detroit, go to EPA, because it's right there.
Thank you.
Thank you.